What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. Pokémon has been around for over 20 years now, and has received worldwide recognition. Even if people aren't fans of the series, they can at least identify some of these creatures as Pokémon, even if the only name they know is Pikachu. It's got that kind of global permeation that many other franchises would kill for. And in fact, it is the highest grossing media franchise of all time. But even with the other branches of this multimedia mega hit being so successful, to many the bread and butter of Pokémon remains their main series of games. These games are the flagship for every new generation unleashed upon the world, and bring in new fans every single time. So, given their importance, I thought it would be interesting to sit down and look at the numbers of the sales of each major game in the Pokémon lineup, and see what they can tell us. Now, I did do my best to find accurate and up-to-date numbers on all of these, but even the discrepancies that I did find aren't too far off, so we can pretty well be assured that this is the lineup. And I really hate to be that guy, but you know who you are. I love that you keep returning, but if you're going to keep coming back here, the least you can do is help out and subscribe. Come on, friend. Okay, let's start at the bottom and work our way up. So, can you guess what the worst-selling mainline Pokémon game has been to date? I certainly couldn't, and I doubt many people would have guessed correctly that it would be Pokémon Crystal. That's right, the beloved Gen 2 classic only grossed a mere 6.39 million units in its lifetime. Which is way more money than we'll ever see, but still. Most of the time, a third version of a generation, like Crystal, is held up as the definitive edition, since it usually fixes problems from the first set of games in a given region. But according to this, a vast majority of Gen 2 Johto players didn't choose this version, as we'll see later. And we also see a pattern start to develop with the third game alternatives, since the next lowest main Pokémon game is Emerald. With only 7.06 million units, Emerald still easily sold well enough to buy a real Emerald, but compared to every other main Pokémon game, it's the second lowest. I hear all the time about how great the Battle Frontier was in Emerald. I personally don't get why, and apparently neither did a few million other people that opted out from the first Gen 3 games. For the next one, if those of you playing at home picked Platinum, congratulations, you were paying attention. Platinum sold around 7.6 million units, which is a bit surprising given the resurgence the DS caused for the franchise. But let this be a lesson to everyone out there. As much as you might think a third version is the definitive one, there are millions more people whose first and only experience with a generation is their initial release of paired games. So, basically, don't be upset if somebody has a different opinion on your favorite region, since they never played a game that fixed its biggest problems. It's probably no shock at this point, but the next one on the list is Black 2 and White 2, which are essentially the third version of the Unova games, selling 8.52 million units. However, things are a bit different this time, since they were full-on sequels, with even bigger differences than usual. This shakeup, and the fact that there were two of them, might account for the larger jump, being almost a full 1 million more copies than the last entry. However, that doesn't explain Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon being next, with 8.77 million units sold. Those games were maybe somewhere in the middle, leaning more towards traditional third iterations than the Unova sequels, but changing up more than the rest of them as well. My only guess is that it had been so long since the third game that people were ready to dive back in again, having waited 5 years since Black and White 2, and almost a full decade since the last true amalgamation game in Platinum. Now, it can't be a coincidence that the bottom 5 sellers in Pokémon history are all additional games coming out after the generation openers. According to the numbers, people just aren't as interested in returning to such a similar experience within the same generation, which makes total sense for the casual fan. Why would they pay twice as much for a chance to play a game again that they haven't even finished yet, or could just restart whenever they want. The millions these games did earn are not to be downplayed, but it seems like most people require a lot more of the new to convince them they need to buy the next Pokémon game. Hey, maybe these numbers are why we never got a Pokémon Z version, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. Now we break into the double digits of millions with Pokémon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee selling 11.97 million units. This is quite impressive as it's the second remake we've seen for the Kanto region, but handily beat the last one on the list by a few million. However, that might be more a testament to the profound popularity of the Switch. Although it can't be overlooked that the crossover appeal for Pokémon Go players also drew in some crowd that normally wouldn't participate this time around. But also keep in mind that the Let's Go games are still relatively new, and will continue to sell on Nintendo's frontline console for a while. Meaning, in all likelihood, they will overtake the next spot currently held by Fire Red and Leaf Green. These Kanto remakes, currently beating the other Kanto remakes, sold right around 12 million units. It's honestly shocking how close these games based on the same region are to one another in overall sales despite being years apart. Just above that, we have Heart Gold and Soul Silver selling a good 12.72 million units. Honestly, I will say I'm a little surprised, since many people claim this as their favorite Pokémon game of all time, so I thought it might be higher, particularly given the prominence of the Johto region as a fan favorite. But as impressive as these numbers are, especially being paired with a Pokewalker accessory, Heart Gold and Soul Silver are still sitting just outside of the top 10. But truthfully, I think I was even more shocked that Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire were able to outsell those games by a pretty hefty margin, at 14.27 million units. This shows another clear pattern within the Pokémon franchise. If third games in a generation perform the worst, remakes will be a solid runner-up. For everybody worrying about Sinnoh remakes, I think we're fine, since they know they can easily get a cool 12 million units out of it, if not more. So, if they're looking at these numbers, you best believe it's coming. Now, the one outlier of the patterns that we've seen thus far is the number 9 best-selling Pokémon game, which was Pokémon Yellow version at 14.64 million units. This is truly notable given that it was in 1998 and sold more than some of these modern games. However, I think we can explain this anomaly by reminding ourselves that Pokémania was truly at its peak at this time in the 90s. It was a great time to be alive. And the fact that Pokémon Yellow had the advantage of being the Pokémon game based on the show. Children who watched the anime and then bought a game would be enticed to get the one with the Pikachu friend, just like Ash had on TV. So Pokémon Yellow is the only third game hanging on strong, and will likely remain in the top 10 at least for another generation or two. Now, obviously, with 8 generations, the top 8 spots will be reserved for brand new region-opening extravaganzas. And the first to fall into the number 8 slot is Pokémon Black and White, selling 15.64 million units. Again, if this is your favorite, don't get mad at me, these are just the numbers. This one does sort of baffle me though, since the barrier to entry here was the lowest in franchise history. Meaning, if you had played any of Gen 4, then you already had a DS that was capable of playing this new one as well. But I think we can guess that the all-new approach that they took, with nothing but original Pokémon in the game, might have actually turned some people away. That, or the fact that they were just still playing those remakes that they bought the year directly before. The number 7 spot belongs to Sun and Moon, which broke over 16.18 million copies sold. I'm sure they appreciated outgrossing the previous second generation on the same console as another, and honestly, that's pretty good considering the 3DS wasn't half as popular as the regular old dual-screen system. The 6th best-selling Pokémon game turns out to be Ruby and Sapphire at 16.22 million units. This is significant not only for slightly outperforming a more modern Pokémon game, but it is also easily the highest-selling Game Boy Advance game ever. In fact, the top 3 GBA games are all Pokémon. So odds are, if you had an Advance, you had a copy of one of these Gen 3 games. If you ever needed proof that Pokémon games were system sellers, look no further. Now we crack the top 5 with Pokémon X and Y, with 16.45 million units. Still very close to the last two. The jump to the 3DS was an exciting one that had the Pokémon go from sprites to full 3D models. Some people say they like the sprites better, but the sales figures don't seem to care. As much as X and Y have their detractors, it seems a few million more people picked these up over some of the other Pokémon choices in the past. And on the plus side, they made the 3DS generations quite profitable. The 4th spot might surprise some people with Pokémon Sword and Shield with 17.37 million units sold. Whatever you might think about these games, it is undeniable that they have been a success. Again, this is likely due in part to the fantastic runaway hit that is the Switch, with many people having a Nintendo system for the first time in years, or ever. So with that new player base, you're bound to get some curious buyers to check out that one video game franchise everyone keeps talking about. And it pains me to say, but it might even continue to go on and outgross our number 3 spot, Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, having sold 17.67 million units. This is really no surprise, since the original DS was the second best-selling video game console of all time, only behind the PS2. And since you can't play Pokémon on your PlayStation, you might as well buy Diamond and Pearl. I personally bought a DS back in the day just to play Diamond, and I got precious few other games to justify the purchase. So these Gen 4 titans did a great job of propping up the franchise, letting people know that it was strong and here to stay. But if you've been keeping track, you can guess what's coming next at the number 2 spot with Pokémon Gold and Silver, clocking in with a massive 23.10 million units. That is a huge jump from the last entry, but it makes sense. As I said, Pokémania was in full swing, and the promise of more of these adorable fighting critters was too much to pass up. Along with going back to another region getting double the fun for your money, it's no wonder you hear Johto as a fan favorite for so many, since according to the numbers anyway, about half of them rarely picked up a Pokémon game again. This also creates the largest gap of any games within the same generation, since as we know, Crystal sold the worst of any of the main series. But of course, in the number 1 place, you know it had to be Pokémon Red and Blue, or Green elsewhere. But these sensation launchers sold a whopping 31.38 million units in their time. That is insane! That's more copies of the first Pokémon games in circulation than original Xboxes. Xbox seemed like a huge deal in its day, but Pokémon was bigger. Red and Blue sit at the top of the all-time best-selling games, not only for the Pokémon series, but for the Game Boy system as a whole, which it justly deserves. It's no wonder this spawned into a worldwide craze when the games alone reached over 31 million people over 20 years ago. And just for kicks, let's look at the best-selling spin-off Pokémon game, which happens to be Pokémon Stadium on the N64 with 5.46 million units. And the worst-selling that I could find is the WiiWare game Pokémon Rumble with a paltry 150,000 sales. So, now that we know the official rankings of Pokémon sales, voted on by the wallets of fans like you, what can we learn from this information? Well, as we saw, there are specific trends to which buyers seem to hold. They are least likely to buy a third game in a generation. However, we can see from the data that over time, this has become less true. The total third game sales increase every time from the last one, hinting that the series is seeing wider reach with each successive generation, allowing more people access than ever before. This also closes the gap on the frontline games, but those have also slowed down a bit over time. The remakes are all squarely in the middle of the pack, over all but one of the additional games, but not as high as the new outings, meaning that people will gladly pay for a retread of something nostalgic over something that they've just seen, but not as much as they would pay for something brand new. Now, it's easy to see the huge spike at the front and say that Pokémon has been going downhill ever since, but it's almost impossible to duplicate something that is a global phenomenon on that scale. Look at the Star Wars movies. Every time there's a big break and the anticipation builds, there's a massive boom in sales. But even though the other ones don't make that same money, it doesn't mean they're a financial failure. They're still incredibly lucrative, and nobody in their right mind really expects them to live up to an international cultural moment like when it first happened. When the next Avengers movie doesn't outgross Endgame, nobody should be disappointed or surprised. But if we look at console eras, we can see not only, as I said, Pokémon was the top seller for the Game Boy, but it had 3 of the top 5, with Gold and Silver 3rd overall best, and Yellow in 5th place for the Game Boy years. Apparently, Crystal version and Pokémon Pinball were also in the top 10. Moving to the Game Boy Advance, Pokémon dominated all 3 top spots, with Ruby Sapphire, Fire Red Leaf Green, and Emerald. Not even Mario could beat Pokémon in these days, and Pokémon Mystery Dungeon also cracked into the top 10. But this reign couldn't last forever. As we mentioned before, the DS was exorbitantly successful for Nintendo, and remains their biggest audience to date. So, with that many different kinds of gamers and varying casual approaches to playing, it's only natural that Pokémon might take a dip in the grand scheme of the system's overall library. Despite being the 3rd highest in series history, Diamond and Pearl only reached the 5th spot in the overall realm of DS games, behind Super Mario Bros., Nintendogs, Mario Kart, and Brain Age. And it's true, I had one of those brain games too, despite never buying or asking for one. It just showed up. The good news is that Black and White just missed out at number 6, and Heart Gold and Soul Silver also cracked the top 10. But both Black and White 2 and Platinum just couldn't stand up to the diverse options available. The 3DS, though, once again proved to be a Pokémon console, with X and Y, Sun and Moon, and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire only being outdone by Mario Kart in the top 5. And the Ultra games also made it into the top 10, so Pokémon has consistently been near the top of all of Nintendo's handhelds. Maybe the transition to a home console hybrid might have scared them, but it shouldn't have. Since as we see on the Switch, Pokémon remains in the top 5 as well, with Sword and Shield only being outdone by some of Nintendo's most technically impressive and critically acclaimed products ever made. There is no shame in Let's Go being at number 7 with all of the extraordinary choices available here, and proves that Pokémon can roll with the quote-unquote big boys of Nintendo. Always could. But maybe the most interesting point to me is that Pokémon sees a greater boost every time they launch on a new console. See, I would have thought that the opposite would be true. Since people already had the system, they could easily buy the next one in line, instead of going to willingly fork over a few $100 in addition to the new game. Now, this might go back once again to the mentality of only one per generation, since each of the third games drops significantly in sales, but that might be true for console generations as well. Maybe people that buy the first Pokémon game for a given console are satiated. They think, this is my Pokémon game for this system, so I don't need another one. It could be a decision based on finances or simply a desire for a wider gameplay experience, since not everybody out there is quite as Pokémon crazed as some of us, so only one per system will do just fine for them. I'm not saying that these second generations are failures, but it's undeniable that with each attempt, a couple of million people don't come back around the second time. Now, the good news is that being on the same console can save on development costs, with the possibility of reused assets, or at the very least a possible familiarity with the coding, so these games theoretically don't need to make quite as much money to break even. But I guess people find the jump to a new console as more worth their time, since it likely comes with a whole new bag of tricks. It looks like they'd rather spend their money to get an experience that they couldn't possibly have gotten before instead of playing a variation of the same old toy box. All I'm saying is, if Gen 9 comes out on the Switch, don't be astonished when it doesn't outsell Sword and Shield, because the data has that down as a near impossibility. But that's just what the numbers have to say. I have thoroughly enjoyed being their mouthpiece, and my mom will just be happy that I finally got to use my MBA for something after all. What interesting patterns can you find in all of the Pokémon sales data? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And we'll see you around next time!